Welcome to Directionally Correct, a People Analytics podcast with Cole and Scott. Today's guest, Holly Lamb, Senior Director of People Analytics and Insights at Syncora. Hey, Directionally Correct fans. If you're looking to stay connected to the podcast, make sure to subscribe to our Substack newsletter, watch our videos on YouTube, or listen to the podcast on your app of choice. This podcast is dedicated to you to help educate and entertain you on how to effectively do people analytics. We are a listener-supported podcast, so please consider becoming a patron. If you'd like to support the podcast by becoming a patron, you can find a link to sign up in the show notes or at patron.podbean.com/directionallycorrect. Thanks for being a listener. All opinions are our own and do not reflect those of any other organization. Well, do you mind if I do a quick PSA?
Sure.
Well, just for the audience, so Scott is obviously not here for this episode. We're trying an experimental episode going forward of having Cole's Corner. So, we've been doing the podcast every other week, and my schedule has loosened up a little bit, so I'm able to do it every week. Scott's still very busy with his day job, and so I've invited my friend Holly Lamb on the podcast. And if this one never comes out, you'll know it was a failure. But if it does come out, it is a success to see if we can do this thing solo on the off week. So every other week, Scott will be here, but on the off weeks, I'll try to do these alone so you guys can quit having to listen to replay episodes. So let's try it out. But welcome Holly for joining us today. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be your guinea pig.
I knew you would be. And I think about every time I talk to you, I think about how we met.
Yes.
And
I was thinking, this is our meet cute story. Do you want to tell everyone about our meet cute story?
Is that an expression nowadays? Do people call it meet cute?
Yes, that's because you haven't seen The Holiday. Clearly, let's add that to
I don't
your
know what
list
that
of
is.
movies to watch.
So is that I presume was that a Christmas movie that came out this year or something?
A while ago, oldie but a goodie.
Okay.
I believe
No.
Kate Winslet, Cameron Diaz, Jude Law, Jack Black. Kate Winslet is the English woman relocated to LA for a holiday. She and Cameron Diaz swap. And Kate Winslet learns of this Hollywood scripting where, as per Hollywood rom-coms, you have a meet cute moment between your two leading characters. We are not romantically involved, let's be clear. But in people analytics land, this is our meet cute story.
Okay, well, so my version of the meet cute, and I'm actually curious to see if it jibes with yours, is I met you because of this podcast.
That's true.
So Scott and I were at Talreos, I guess 2 years ago, maybe 3, I'm not sure. Yeah. And we were prepping to record our first live episode at Talreos. Mm-hmm. And we went into an empty conference room, and there was a woman working in there with her headphones on, being incredibly introverted and studious. Mm-hmm. And we were in there probably prepping for 2 hours. And this person was just typing away, very furiously working. Yeah. And I was like, and I think it was about time we were about to record the podcast that you got up and you came over and you're like, hey guys. And we're like, did you hear everything we were saying? And you're like, no, I was working. Right. I was like, okay, great. Then that person was you. Yeah. So that's how I met you, Holly.
That sounds about right. It was, I probably snuck out of a session at Talreos and had to take care of things that were happening during the day job. I don't think I had listened to your podcast at that point, and I don't know that you had talked yet at Talreos.
I had not, no. And nobody was listening at that point anyway. So you were not alone. I mean, we could debate whether they're listening anyway yet, but still. Yeah. It was that was an interesting experience. I am curious though. So that led to a variety of other ways of us connecting, and we ended up writing an article together at one point. Do you remember that?
I do. Well, it was at that same Talreos where I introduced myself. I said, hi, nice to meet you. And then maybe that later that day or the day after, you were doing your session, which was a little bit of a preview of one of the articles you had written. kind of around the philosophical position around what PA could or shouldn't be doing, and the provocative statement of people analytics is viewed as a luxury item for organizations, right? Um, and that's probably truer than ever as we kind of continue to see how the workforce kind of shapes out and how these PA roles shape out. Um, and then you ask the audience a question of like, who are decision makers? Like, who has a role in influencing a decision? And a few of us raised our hands. I raised my hand. Um, and then I think afterwards we were like, hey, this was kind of interesting. We should probably talk more. And that was about it.
Well, yeah, and I think contextually why that's so important is because you hold or held, I guess I could say, because I think you came back to from the dark side to the light side a little bit, but you held at the time you worked in the
Yeah.
business, right? So you were no longer in people analytics. You're an IO psychologist by training as well, but you were working in the business at the time, and that positioned you as a decision maker. Do you want to talk about that at all?
I mean, it was probably one of the biggest career pivots of my life, and I wouldn't change any minute of it. I knew if I hadn't done it, I would have regretted it. And so I try not to live with regrets. I had joined at that time US Foods, and I was there for a total of about 7 years. I'm currently at Syncora. At my tenure at US Foods, I had entered the culture and engagement team, and I stood up mostly the survey program, but filled a need in people analytics. So that was about 2017 to 2019 when the labor market was really hot, certainly before COVID. And among warehouse distribution, there was a lot of turnover. There was a lot of turnover in general in the labor market. So I was there at a time where I could help answer questions, and I did. And it was a great learning experience to be able to do that. But I think those answers just got people's attention, and those answers led to more questions. And a lot of those questions tended to be about what our talent strategy and workforce strategy would be, how that helped our operations team achieve goals from a strategic transformation. And so what I did was basically start up some of the inklings of workforce planning and labor management and staffing in kind of a more cross-functional, rigorous way. Um, so when the door opened to join the supply chain team to help with the transformation, to infuse culture and talent in a lot of the decisions that were um, much more driven traditionally by operations and finance. I was like, cool, like, I don't do that. you, you know, I'm not an industrial engineer. I'm an industrial organizational psychologist. And they're like, yeah, but like, we like what you bring to the table. And I was like, okay, I'll come. And it took a while to adjust, right? Like, I had no idea what the role would entail. It was essentially being a combination of chief of staff, being a combination of workforce planning, strategic development and transformation, as well as portfolio management. So big stretch in lots of directions, but fundamentally it was about data and people and helping the business make the right decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell me, kind of come back. What is the chasm? So the title of the article we wrote together is "Breaking the Illusion of a Chasm."
Mm-hmm.
And I'll share my screen. What's the chasm we're talking about, and how is it related to businesses making decisions versus HR being the customer of people analytics?
Yeah, so when we kind of first struck up our relationship, it was around this idea of how can people analytics help influence decisions and decision makers, and being maybe as far as the decision owner. Um, and that struck me as interesting, having kind of sat on both sides of the aisle. And then
Say more about that. Why? Why is that interesting?
because that was something that I also like yearned for in my career, right? Like
Yeah.
the reason why I liked being in culture engagement was I could use the analytics from the survey to be able to help design programs from scratch that would address a need that the data and people were saying we had. And so I could own it more end to end, right? And that was much more getting my hands dirty than I did as an external consultant, which is what I did before. I did a lot of the external data analysis and conclusion making, but then I said, all of the fixing, that's yours. So I like to fix problems. and I
Yeah.
kind of realized that throughout the course of my career. So the decision maker and being on both sides of the aisle, you can be a great people analyst. And I think depending on what value you're looking to provide, that value comes in what people do with the insights you get from the
Yeah.
data. Um, and I mean, most of the time when we're sitting in organizations, the reality is we're there to help drive revenue and profits and a healthy book of business and a healthy P&L. That's what investors are looking for. That's what the board's looking for. That's what the executive team is looking for.
Do people analytics teams know that, generally
I
speaking?
don't know. I,
Right?
we are very far sometimes from this like value stream.
Yeah. Well, and because this is so prescient at the moment. I put together a LinkedIn post the other day, and it kind of got a lot of feedback, and I call it the scorekeeper fallacy. And it was talking about moving from being decision support to being decision makers.
Mm-hmm.
And it was funny how so many people agreed with the notion and then so many people disagreed with the notion. They were like, no, we are decision support and we will always be decision support.
Yep.
And then other folks said, we should be decision makers because we have this linkage to the profitability of the business and the revenue and all the stuff that you were just mentioning a second ago. And it brought something to my attention that I'm not sure I was aware of, which is I think a lot of people analytics folks don't realize that we have a duty to help the business run effectively. And that was eye opening for me. And I think it's very much related to the thesis of the breaking the illusion of a chasm article.
Well, like people analytics practitioners come from all sorts of backgrounds, right? Like we didn't exist in our, you could argue this whole PA movement didn't exist 10 years ago. It existed in some other form and it grew out because of a variety of reasons. I'm not the historian here. We can debate that. But that was
Sure.
because I would hear over and over again in various kind of meetups and articles and spaces, people analytics leaders kind of frustrated that they couldn't get stakeholders' attention for the great work that they were doing. Whether
Quote unquote great work.
Yeah, right. And so then you think about, well, why is that, right? What role do we play in helping to alleviate that, and what can we change about that? Um, I mean, I sit now back in a people analytics function in HR. So yes,
Well, let's talk about that. Like, so you made the transition. I think you used to work in consulting, and I'd like to get to that
yep,
later. You went
yep,
internal. You went from being an internal people analytics person into the
hmm
business as a decision
yep.
maker, and now you're back in people analytics. Have you tried to maintain that level of decision making, or have you just slotted yourself into decision support? And what has that transition been like?
Yeah. It took a hot minute to adjust. I mean, I'm still adjusting, right? So I'm like 5 or 6 months into the role, learning how decisions get made, how we operate as an HR function, and how we support the business. That's been a lot of my time trying to figure out how we do that and how should we do that, right? But part of why I took up the role was to take up the challenge of trying to steer and elevate the people analytics team that has had such great success, like prior to my joining. And part of the reason why I joined was because it's a very well respected team, very well positioned, and has done a lot of great foundational work that buys us a seat at the table. Um, but I think the people, the stakeholders, our internal customers know that because the team has done a lot of great work, there's opportunity to do more, right? And so the scope, as I joined, the scope of the team expanded to include workforce planning, and I brought that as a newer capability for the team, but also data governance and being able to build out more of our data infrastructure to support like more groups within the business. So it is it's a good problem to have within Syncora, but it continues to be a challenge like we hear kind of no matter what people analytics circles we encounter. And yes, I love a good challenge. So I came back to HR. It has been a transition to figure out like where the team is positioned relative to the decision makers, how we get the attention of people for the great work we're doing, and constantly trying to align the work that we're doing to make sure that we're providing value at the right time.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. When I think about you, you've thrown out a few words today. So you've thrown out workforce planning, you've thrown out people analytics, and we've also talked about IO psychology as well. Are those all synonyms? Are they all the same thing? Are they different? What I mean, I'm asking you. I mean, I can give my opinions on it if you like, but what are your thoughts on that? Because you've been a practitioner in all three spaces, and how do you define them? I guess maybe first of all, and then second, what do they mean in practical application?
I was thinking sort of about this question differently when I got asked a couple of days ago. Um,
Well, answer it that way then. I don't
oh
care.
no, that's fine. I got asked like, "Oh, is this your first people analytics role?" Because like I've never seen people analytics in your title before, and I'm like, "Gosh, is it?" I was
Yeah, that's a good question. Is it?
like, "Do you have to have people analytics in your job title to be considered a people analytics leader?" And I'm like, "Wait, aren't IO psychologists some of the original PA practitioners out there?" Um, So I don't know that I have the answer, and I'm sure others would love a healthy debate.
Oh, come on, take a stance. What do you really think?
I think of
Come
this
on.
as a Venn diagram where it's not quite the same, right? Just based on training and background and experiences and what you have to deliver. I think of them as distinct circles, but with a lot of overlap in a Venn diagram. And so you got IO psychology here, which is grounded in psychological theories, statistical methodology. You've got your scientist, research practitioner with kind of good foundation to do inferential statistics, but grounded in theory, right? And then you have your people analytics, which can be kind of a lot of descriptive statistics in service of a business problem. But you kind of need a little bit of both in order to then make the leap to having outcomes that will drive a position and a decision. You can do both like without each other, but in order to make the outcome, I think you need a little bit of both.
And what about workforce planning?
I think that's where you have to start dovetailing in with businesses and their operating models and their financial
Mhm.
rhythms to be able to figure out how the data and the forecasting element of the workforce and how you design the workforce informs the business plan and vice versa. So that's why it's not exactly the same, and but connected from a methodology, data foundations, org design principles, um, and statistical methodology, but it's not exactly the same.
Yeah. Well, maybe we'll do a quick pivot to another Venn diagram that I was curious about in talking to you. What are the three words or countries of origin about Canadian, American, and Chinese?
Mm.
And how do they overlap and relate?
Well, so in my personal context, I'm Chinese, right?
I want to learn about you.
Yeah.
Come on.
So my parents immigrated to Canada in the early 70s from Hong Kong and China, kind of byproduct of China's revolution, right? My sister and I were born and raised in Canada. We were specifically born and raised in Quebec, which also through the 70s was going through its own cultural revolution through English and French language
French.
identity,
Mhm.
right? Um, and then we, growing up in Montreal, so language of choice at home was Chinese. Went to school in English. And then by way of the language climate, we then had French immersion. So layer that on. Um, I eventually left Quebec and Canada to go to grad school at Purdue. So go Boilermakers.
One of the most illustrious PhD programs. It is an excellent program.
Yep. And continue strong to today. So I'm very happy to be part of that IO heritage. And then, so did my time there and never left, partly because I also met my husband in our research methods class, who is also Canadian and has two PhDs who came to America separately for PhDs. We decided to stay here afterwards. Um,
Was it a meet cute?
I probably, yeah, and research methods. Like, what's not to love about that meet cute?
I'm learning things. See, I pick it up
That's
quick.
right. So yeah, I mean, I've been in America longer than I've been in Canada. I didn't appreciate my multilingual abilities until I left Canada, and I I would say the look back at the cultural influence relative to my career and how I've been able to um, adapt to different roles with different stakeholders and internal customers has partly been because I grew up in an environment where people were different. I was different, and so I think it was just kind of constantly paying attention to people and environments and situations that helped me be curious and learn. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I have a dumb question for you, which is you know you grew up speaking three languages. How long did it before you picked up the fourth language of America? Was that hard?
It's weird. Yeah, it's sometimes a little weird. It took me a while to figure out what a Hoosier was. So, I'm not
I
sure
bet.
I don't know that I can articulate it. But
I'm not sure I can either.
yeah. No, it's like goofy things where you look at a HRS file and you look at states and you're like, what are those two-letter abbreviations? And as a Canadian, like you just don't learn those. But as a Canadian working in America, you have to quickly learn those. So yeah.
Absolutely. Well, the Purdue program has some stellar academics and research associated with it, but you also got to work earlier in your career at one of the few institutions that employed a lot of really great researchers in the practitioner side of things that are heavily involved in PsyOp at Volterra. Do you mind sharing a little bit about that and how that was kind of a unique experience?
I mean, I was pretty strategic, I would say, in my choice of where I would go for my first gig out of grad school. I had gotten advice from prior grad students, alumni, and I think one of the things that I took to heart was if you're going to make the change from academia, grad school environment to being a practitioner, one of the things you might consider is just how many other IO psychologists there are in your future place of work, because that creates potentially a hurdle if you're kind of the lone wolf and you're having to explain and justify the things that you do or your methodology or your approaches to other people. Whereas, that barrier of entry is much lower if you're in an environment where there are other psychologists. I'm like, okay, like noted. Um, and I knew it would be tough for me to kind of adjust. So I was like, where could I go where I'm doing interesting work, where I'm working with people who are doing cool things, who also have that shared understanding and background of kind of where I come from an IO psychology background, um, but who are doing it in industry. And so when I had the chance to join Valterra, I remember going to the interview on site and kind of running through my day, running through the interviews, doing the work sample, and then impromptu, Bill Macy was able to come interview me, and I was nervous because it's the Dr. Bill Macy, and he's as warm and nerdy as you would expect.
Yeah.
But yeah, I joined. I happily joined. I spent over a decade at Valterra that eventually got bought out by CEB. And we were primarily a survey practitioner house, along with then the selection and assessment side of the house. And you usually kind of specialized in one, but usually there would be big projects where you could dabble in a little bit of both. Um, and I learned so much about how to be this scientist practitioner. With Bill, Ben Schneider was our loved co-author and kind of research guru. And I mean, Nancy Tippins with her lovely Southern accent would, come join and tell us about the latest and greatest on the selection assessment side. And a whole slew of other talented IO psychologists. Um, yeah, it was a special moment, kind of looking back at it, because particularly in the survey space, right? Surveys quickly, with the advent of technology, kind of heavily became commoditized. And so having that specialized skill set and practitioner to be able to work with companies, it just kind of became harder as a business model to execute. So I don't know that current survey providers have kind of the same framework for the value of the consulting staff, but it was a great time to be able to grow and learn in that business.
It was from the outside, it was a weird thing to see where there were all these IO firms and they all got bought up and then they all got spun off again. And it was like, what is going on here?
Right?
And yeah, it was kind of just like everything got churned up in that process.
Well, I think the industry was trying to figure out how to, frankly, make money off of this burgeoning technology that became accessible, and to be able to differentiate while, you know, continuing to keep these businesses afloat. So,
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, going back to you mentioned this earlier, but I wanted to kind of put it out there again. Is like you asked this question: is do you have to be in people analytics to be considered a people analytics leader?
yeah.
What yeah.
Do you?
What I don't know. And I mean, technically I'm not in people analytics anymore. And I think I'm a people analytics leader, but I don't know. Maybe I am, maybe I'm not.
I don't know, right? Maybe we should ask our friends at the Society for People Analytics.
Oh my gosh. Okay. I guess I'm involved in that too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, with that said, do you want to try out so the confusion matrix and the nerdy, those are Scott's sections. So I don't want to step on those. And so I've decided, and it may sound similar to some of those things, but I've decided to create a section called Cole's Corner.
Okay.
And if these don't work, feel free to say, Cole, this stinks, and we'll try it again differently next time. But do you want to join me in Cole's Corner?
Okay. Let's go.
Welcome to Cole's Corner. So the first section, I've got a few random rapid fire questions for you.
Okay.
What musical act was most formative for your musical taste and why?
I really loved kind of 90s female rock, I would say, or I went through a phase where I loved Luscious Jackson. They were kind of a spin-off of Beastie Boys. Liz Phair was right up there. Garbage. Like I'll go back. I'll go through cycles, but I do, as my older middle-aged self, I really appreciate like my teenage self loving these kind of female rock bands. I love Britpop, like the whole Blur, Oasis, Suede, Elastica. I don't know how they influence me necessarily. And I mean, I would say music in general. I don't play an instrument. I
Mm-hmm.
um I probably have music appreciation. Like I literally took a class in university called music appreciation.
Look at you. You appreciate it
I do.
now.
I do appreciate music. I probably appreciated music before then. I think it just helps the creative brain open up to different sounds and flavors and think about what the art of possible is.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes I feel like music is garbage, but other times I feel like it's an oasis. You get what I'm putting down there?
Um, I will also say it's amazing how cyclical music can be, just like everything else. Yeah. So it's a healthy reminder of that.
That was such a bad
That
joke.
was very
All right. I got another question for you.
okay.
So, what's the place you've never been that you'd most like to go and why?
Um, hmm. I owe my friend a visit to Sri Lanka.
Oh, okay.
My cohort mate Shamala was she went back to Sri Lanka after grad school, and
Hmm.
she came back to visit once or twice. But yeah, it's on the list of places to go.
Do you like spicy food?
Yeah, I feel like I could handle some, probably like mid, you know,
Okay. Yeah.
not too spicy, but uh, more than just mild.
Why do you do what you do?
I have a curiosity about why people do what they do,
Hmm.
plus a desire to make work life better at scale for people. Um, and the bonus in doing that would be to helping a company function and perform better. But I get to do that using data and math and talking to people, to be able to connect the dots that I don't think others would necessarily see.
All right. I've got another section for you.
Okay.
So Scott always used to make fun of me because he said I was like asking people comprehensive exam questions
Yeah.
on the
Uh huh.
podcast. But I've got a test where I'm going to do one big question,
Okay.
and we haven't talked about it at all today, so that's good. If you were building a people analytics function from scratch today, and there were minimal constraints, so there's no constraints, but there's minimal constraints, you can get the resources you need.
Yeah.
Where would you place your bets on AI being the most helpful? And then just conversely, like where are you placing your energy and effort to help make that become a reality?
Um, so, I mean, the quick answer is in those minutia repetitive tasks that the team might do from either the data infrastructure side and or the analytics to set it up on a recurring basis, to then do like some basic descriptive reporting, trending, tracking, all of that. um, what I would like it to do more of is to help synthesize, and provide some insights. I haven't seen it do that yet. I would like it to. Um,
And what would that look like in practice? Like what is I can't even say the word synthesization and insights in practice.
yeah,
Synthesis is the easy way.
right. So in a future world where we've scaled our analytics, democratized it, provide it in a self-serve forum for our end users, whether it's managers, HR partners, whoever else in the business, it would basically tell them kind of whisper to them what Cole or Holly might have otherwise told them in a one-on-one about what the data are saying. That's what I hope AI to be able to build for us in terms of a product for our end users. And then your other question was what am I doing to help make that happen?
Well, yeah, like where are you play? Like I thought about wording it like where are you placing your bets, but I don't think that's really what I want to ask, which is like where are you placing your energy and effort? Because obviously there's only 24 hours in the day.
Yeah.
You can only focus on so many things. Where are you focusing?
I mean, right now it's learning, right? Right now it's
Yeah.
arming the team to learn and think about what the art of possible is, because I don't know that we've seen it do great things other than your typical use cases that you see out there, right? So given finite time in the day, here and now, it's learn as fast as you can to think about what it could do for us. Because I don't know that we have an answer, but we need to learn fast and fail fast at it to be able to then figure out where to go faster.
Awesome. Well, do you want to do the what I'm reading section?
Sure.
All right. So the first article that I came across lately is it's unlikely that the main conclusion of Google's Project Aristotle is true. So did you get a chance to read this, Holly?
I did.
Okay. You want me to give a kind of a quick summary of it and then we can talk about it?
Yep.
Okay. So the author, and I can't remember his name and I apologize for that, but he basically was saying how, Google did some really really famous research called Project Aristotle, which was showing, they looked at every variable under the sun that showed what does it take to make an effective team. And the net of it was that the number one thing that they found was psychological safety.
Mm.
Now, what sometimes got lost is there were other factors as well, such as dependability, structure and clarity, meaning and impact of the team.
Yep.
And they can, we'll have a hyperlink to the article in the notes if you want to go and read it. But what was heard is that it's all psychological safety.
Yeah.
And the author comes along and says, well, maybe there's a few reasons to doubt that this conclusion is true. And one is the overall replication crisis that's going on in the social sciences, that no independent eyes looked on their work before quote unquote publishing, since it never technically went through like a peer reviewed journal.
Mm-hmm.
And then the unwillingness just to share their procedures, statistical methods, and data with other researchers that could come in and validate their work.
Mm-hmm.
So, what did you think about this one, Holly?
Well, at first I was trying to figure out, is this person saying that psychological safety isn't needed at all? They didn't say that, which I was like, because I don't think it was only Google who was saying it's important. Plenty of other researchers have said it's important. But yeah, like whether it's the sole thing that determines effective group performance and functioning, uh, why people picked it up as the headline, I totally get it. Our brains are kind of wired to keep the message simple, right? So if Google found 8 things, are we going to remember the 8 things that they that they said were the contributing factors? Probably not. Maybe 1 or 2. But yeah, there is a story that a confirmation bias that people like that makes a good story, and I mean that's what the New York Times was trying to sell.
Yeah.
What Google was trying to sell with it is a little unclear, but they also, when you look at their Project Aristotle summary and on their site with kind of guides for better team effectiveness, they list all the things, not just psychological safety.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, I guess there's a few different areas I want to go into what you said, because you said a lot of fascinating things. One I'll start with is just, I think in media sometimes don't let facts get in the way of a good story.
Yeah.
Right. And so, and this is not Google's fault, but it is the New York Times fault for, oversimplifying a somewhat complex message to make it palatable and I guess memorable, which is a good thing.
Right.
Right. But that leads to the second point, which the authors did not say that, psychological safety doesn't help. But I have seen other research, and we may have even talked about it on the podcast, that shows that an over reliance, like there was like this overcorrection that happened because of this research, that organization said all that matters is psychological safety. And if we sense any psychologically unsafe environments, that's going to, put a damper on any kind of creativity. And I've even seen things that have said that that's actually stifled the ability to share
Yeah.
opinions, and that perhaps has been detrimental to team performance. And then the last, what was it? Thing that you said, I don't know, it'll come back to me, but like, how do you react to that?
I mean, I think it's like everything else in life. You need a healthy dose of moderation. So, um, yeah, like when there is a balance of psychological safety, um, there's enough to get people to want to speak out when there's something not quite right. But if people are so comfortable, and I don't know if it's necessarily psychological safety, but if the psychological
Mhm.
safety is leading to an environment where everyone's comfortable with status quo
Sure.
as opposed to questioning status quo for better or for worse, I think that's the part where it leads to potentially detrimental
Yeah,
performance, right? So,
absolutely.
yeah.
I did remember what the last thing was, and it was the criticisms about it not being like the replication crisis going on. Well, guess what? Google did this research. It wasn't done in academia,
Mhm.
so why should they even be responsible for the replication crisis that's going on somewhere else? But the last criticism was that Google should be sharing their data. And the question I wanted to pose to you is, should an organization, if they're doing what I would call like a public good, so they did some research internally
Yep.
and they just decided out of the kindness of their hearts to share it publicly, should they be responsible for having to share their proprietary internal data or just any kind of data
Yeah.
for others to validate it? Like, is that, like, I understand how that happens in academia, but this wasn't academic research,
No.
right? So should that be a knock against their research, is that it wasn't shared publicly? Because I'd say as a practice, 99%, if not greater, internal people analytics work is never shared broadly,
Yeah, I mean,
right?
you could argue the same thing for any vendor saying that their tool does XYZ, right? Like, well, where's your validation study? And what's the sample size? And what was your methodology? And is it really true? And should I buy it? Right?
Yeah.
In that context, like, yes, you're paying for a service, so you probably are owed a little bit more. But I mean, Google is putting out those guides as a free service to the
Yeah.
public. Like, use buyer beware, right? Like, be cautious. Um,
Well, and I mean, I'll actually give firms like Volterra a little bit of credibility here, which is a lot of times firms like that, they actually would go and try to publish some of their research
mhm.
to show that there was a second set of eyes, or more than a second set of eyes, to validate that what they're doing did work. So I would actually make an argument that some firms do more of it than maybe even internal people analytics teams do.
Yeah, and I mean, even as an internal analytics team, right? Like, you do want to do an analysis and you do want to be able to sell the story, right? So, do when we're pitching a decision and guidance to an executive team, are we showing all of our homework? No,
Yeah.
right? We
Well, and they'll even be mad at you if you do.
right. Like, they're there for the quick takeaways and the headlines, and trust that
Mhm.
you've done your analysis, right? So,
Correct.
um,
And sometimes they disagree with it, and sometimes they'll say, "Hey, I've got my own internal data science team.
yeah,
I want you to vet your numbers with our numbers and see if they jibe up." Just in the critical case, but I'll just go ahead and say my opinion, which is I don't think Google has any responsibility to share their data broadly if they don't want to. And organizations who took their research carte blanche and just implemented it as if it were their organization probably should have done their own research, right? Probably should have tested it out internally without just saying, you know what, Google has discovered enlightenment and we should just adopt enlightenment.
I like that healthy skepticism.
Well, I mean, that's kind of the reason that people analytics teams exist.
Yeah,
There's not just one at one organization. They're in every major organization. And it's because every organization needs to figure out, like, there are some, like, let's call them universals that probably exist everywhere. Like, if you treat people terribly, they're probably going to quit, right? That's probably a universal.
yep.
But unless you just pay insane like investment banks or something like that, right? I mean, there's always an exception, but if you just, but like there are universals, but there are things that are specific to particular cultures and particular operating models and particular styles. And, maybe it's good to look at that for yourself.
I mean, I think it's always healthy to question, is what we're doing working for us? And should we try something different?
See, that's what I love about you, Holly. You always give the practical points. Like I used to say, I made a career off answering the single question is how do you know what you're doing is working?
Mm.
Right.
Yeah,
Now it's more complicated than that, but that's kind of a simple distillation of it. But I don't know. Any more you want to say on that one?
I think I'm good.
All right. Let's pick up the next one. And this is about remote work, which I actually did a moratorium at one point where we were just not going to talk about remote work anymore on the podcast because we talked about it too many times. But it's been a little while, so I wanted to bring it back. And this is from a researcher, Daniel Zhao, who works at Glassdoor. And they did, well, I guess he's quoting some other researchers from Harvard, UCLA, and Brown that found that tech workers, so tech workers in particular,
Mhm.
would be willing to take a 28% pay cut for a remote position compared to a fully in-person role. And that was followed by they would be willing to take a 22% pay cut rather than go work at a company that had a 1-star review on Glassdoor. And now everybody, we can debate on the validity of Glassdoor ratings. They also talked about quality of life and whether or not it's a public company and a few other things, but 28% pay cut for a remote position versus in person. And this is really relevant with so many firms that have been announcing publicly these 5-day return to office mandates.
Yep.
How does this jibe for you?
I mean, I think the authors of that working paper also said like that our number of 28% is a lot higher than other estimates in previous studies, right? Previous studies said they were like 5 to 10% pay cut might be what people would tolerate for a remote role. Um,
Yeah.
so
This is like a revealed preferences versus, stated preferences argument. Like people might state 28%, but is it really 28%?
yeah,
Right.
I mean, I have that healthy skepticism, kind of I'll see it when I believe it. Um, but I like it's very clear that remote roles are becoming very quickly a premium out there. I don't know what that premium is. 28% seems really high. But
Well, tell me what you think about this because I think one of the things that's happened is it's not necessarily that organizations are saying, "Ha, we should pay people less because they're remote." What's happening is a supply and demand effect where there's a huge supply of people that are willing to take a remote role, and there's very little supply of remote positions, or there's less, not very little, but less than there was maybe a few years ago.
mhm,
And so you're just seeing market dynamics at play.
yeah,
I am curious what you think about this though, which is, and I don't mean this from like a policy perspective, or you're not speaking on behalf of your employer when you say this, but like imagine you've got remote based positions. What's to stop organizations from just employing people outside of their country's borders? Right? If location doesn't matter,
mhm,
how far does that location not mattering extend? Presuming like let's say they're within a few time zones from one another. How far does that extend? Because there's plenty of organizations that could remote their workers to a Caribbean island or South America or something that are still within very reasonable time frames, but that would drastically reduce the wages that they would need to pay for those positions.
I mean, I don't that is I think there's some precedent to that already, right? Where
Mhm.
companies will move entire cost centers offshore, essentially. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I think it depends on how the market dynamics will play out in terms of what companies are going to pay for remote roles and what, the job seekers are
Mhm.
willing to take in order to figure out, is it going to be cost effective for them? I don't know that remote work was ever really positioned as a cost savings play, right?
Mhm.
The way offshoring has typically played out.
That's why I brought it up.
Yeah.
And the reason is because I don't think that people who are advocating for remote positions, I'm saying this, I work remotely, so this affects me just as much as anybody
Yep.
else. And that they're not understanding that there are unintended consequences. One of which is if you take location specific pay, that is grounded to a particular geographical area,
Hmm.
and you have to pay commensurate wages in that area to be competitive. But if you go remote, that actually tends to slide towards a global pay rate.
Right.
Well, the global pay rate is much lower than probably the pay rate that most people are traditionally used to receiving.
Yep.
And so that could be another thing, that it may not be a 28% deduction, or it could actually be greater than 28% actually, in a lot of cases. But organizations may not be able to get away with that from a market competitive standpoint.
Right.
But if you really think of every remote position as potentially paying a global wage rate, that could have drastic consequences for people that are looking for remote roles.
Yeah, no, very much so. But yes, right now, the demand and supply dynamic isn't quite there yet, right? So
Yep.
we'll see.
We'll see. All right, I saved the the hardest one for last. I don't know if you actually got a chance to read this one, but it was excellent, but also incredibly dense. So this is a friend of the podcast, Scott Ryda, who works at AWS.
Hmm.
He published an article called "The Augmented Workforce: Redefining Roles and Hierarchies in the Age of Generative AI."
Yep.
And I will probably misexplain this article because it's pretty complicated, but I think what he's done is he's created a synthetic organization
Hmm.
and showed how AI could potentially impact early career roles, mid and senior level roles, and expert roles over the next, I believe, 10 or 15 years. I think it goes all the way to 2035.
Yep.
One of the interesting things that he finds is this finding of what's called a levolution that happens, he projects in 2028, where basically all different kinds, whether it's expert, entry level, or mid career, kind of morph into one level of worker that is needed. And I want to come back to that in a second in terms of the implications of that.
Hmm.
But there's a few other interesting findings in here about what did we find that automation is going to it's going to impact, I think, upwards of 60% of tasks by 2030, or no, 75% of tasks by 2035.
Hmm.
And that's a lot. And what does that do to organizations and thinking about how they workforce plan into the future?
Yeah.
I don't know, there was a lot of meat on the bone in here. But what were your reactions to this article, Holly? And then we can come back to some of this.
I mean, I love the imagination of being able to use AI to figure out how AI is going to replace people. um, so I think it was consistent with the things that I've experienced and like read about as it relates to how people could and should interact with AI, and will AI replace people, right? And a lot of it, to me, what I took away from that article was that yes, it will eliminate a lot of that repetitive tasks, but it just means a lot of the things the skills to oversee the bots and make sure that the bots are generating the right conclusions and results is going to be more critical than ever. And so you don't see that degradation of need for some of those other types of analytical strategic thinking skills that other positions currently and will require. That was kind of my takeaway. I don't know if you saw that.
No, I did see that. And the thing, I'll build on it for a second, which is coming back to this notion of the levolution,
Hmm.
right? And so anytime someone makes a projection into the future, especially if they're using like dummy data,
Yeah.
but like let's say even if you're using real data, my personal way of validating it, and this is sort of like a Bayesian approach, and is like using your priors, but is, do I see a manifestation of that trend in the real world already?
Hmm.
And do I see the logical reasoning for why that trend will continue or get exacerbated in the future.
Okay.
And the main takeaway that I had from it about this levolution of this kind of condensation between all roles becoming one type of role, whether you're early career expert, what have you. And what I see is a lot of folks are saying how it's really hard to get an entry level job nowadays,
Mm,
right? Especially in technical professions. And I think you're seeing the precursors to this levolution, which is it's going to be really hard unless you have a already established baseline level of competence in a particular position to be able to for AI to augment you,
yeah.
right? So the reasoning here is that you have some level of expertise, and then AI by 2035 will augment up to 75% of what you do. But what's left in that 25% is expertise.
Hmm.
Well, how does one gain said expertise? And that's through experiences, usually in education and all of that type of work. And I think what we're already seeing is there's like a ladder being pulled up on people right now, which is they're not able to get their foot in the door for those entry level positions to gain the experience to then get to that levolution that was being talked about in the article. And so I do think that there's some efficacy to what he's putting forward, but just seeing those trends already at play right now.
Right.
I don't know. Have you noticed that as well?
I've not noticed it as much. So, I mean,
Okay, maybe it's me.
no, I mean, I'm just trying to think through. Like, my husband's a college professor, and he has a lot of seniors, and so I'm just like thinking through kind of what the job market for them has been like over the past couple of years, right? Um, but yeah, like typically, if you've had an internship, it gets you further, your
Hmm.
foot in the door much faster, right? I
Yeah.
don't.
Well, I've seen it anecdotally from people I know. I've seen it through research out there that recent college graduates are having a harder time than in prior years of getting first time employment.
Mhm.
I even saw an article the other day, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal, that showed that even the top MBA programs from Harvard and Stanford and yada yada yada, they, had historically high levels of people not having jobs
Yep.
upon graduation. And those would be the people that would be most likely to be employed, not least.
Right. I mean, the same goes for lawyers, right? Like, there's a lot of traditionally highly educated jobs in the workforce that are getting harder to fill. Is that because of a levolution, or is that a precursor to a levolution? I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, there's Scott Rada. He was actually pinging me back and forth about this article when it first came out,
Yeah.
and I was like faking it, like I actually understood what he did. But I'll probably have him on the podcast at some point because he's a good dude. But yeah, this is fascinating stuff, and I just thought that you, with your background not only in IO psychology and people analytics, but workforce planning, would have a unique take on this. But this has been a fascinating conversation, Holly. Anything we haven't talked about that you wanted to make sure we brought up today?
What else are you gonna do with your Cole's Corner every other week without Scott time?
I think you're looking at it. I'm gonna try out some stuff. I'm gonna experiment and see how it goes. What's your feedback? Did you like it? Is it too much? Is it not enough? I,
Uh,
Scott brings a very cool element to this podcast, and I am not that. And so I don't know. I did my best.
That's all right. Yeah, we missed Scott, but it was pretty fun having some chit chat. No, it was good. It was good for me to kind of see other reading sources that I don't necessarily pay attention to. And yes, I wouldn't pretend to keep track otherwise. But um, no, I mean, I think maybe part two of some future conversation might be like, how do you define a people analytics professional?
Well, yeah, I think that's a good question. Like this sounds so cheesy, but is it in your heart? You know,
No.
that is such a bad answer.
That was bad.
Well, I think, like from a legacy standpoint, like because again, I mean, I'm the VP of research for Lightcast now, and that's not technically a people analytics job. I mean, I guess you could say it is, depending on what your Venn diagram is from earlier in the conversation.
Yeah.
Um, but I do work on people data, and it is analytics. So technically, it's people analytics, but it's a stretch. It's not in my job title.
Right.
But I think I've spent so much time in my career on it. I'm writing a book on it. I have a podcast on it. I've written like 50 plus articles on it. I
It's in your
think
heart.
that makes, yeah, I think it's in my heart, uh, which is the thing that matters the most. I don't know. Maybe that's a good place to wrap on, Holly. But you've been a fantastic guest today. Anywhere that people can find you, or any parting words to our listeners?
Um, I, I would say don't let a title define you. How about that?
There you go.
Yeah.
Good. That's perfect. It's in your heart. Don't let a title define you. Is IO psychology and people analytics the same thing? You notice when I kind of swerved away from that one for a second. But yeah, well, you've been listening to Directionally Correct, a People Analytics podcast with Cole and Scott, and today's guest, Holly Lamb. Thanks for joining us, Holly. And do you think we should do Cole's Corner? Does it work? Do you want to publish it?
I say keep going, keep trying.
Oh, that is such positive and negative feedback at the same time.
That's
All right.
right.
Well, thanks for joining us, Holly.
All right. Thanks for having me.